Aloha. Welcome to the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum Education Webinar Series. I'm William Spincola, your host, and at the Aviation Museum here at Pearl Harbor, we have this special education program webinar series where we discuss World War II history, Pearl Harbor history, aviation history, and a whole lot more. The Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum is located on historic Ford Island in the very middle of Pearl Harbor Estuary, in the middle of the Pearl Harbor Navy base. We want to invite all of you to come to visit us at any time. We are the stewards of America's World War II aviation battlefield. Where we are sitting right now is just about 600 meters from where the first piece of ordnance fell on the Pearl Harbor air raid on December 7th, 1941. Please come and visit us. Our museum is in the process of an incredible transformation to improve itself, and we want you all to see that. Our webinar series involves aviation topics, as we said, of interest. And today's topic is very unique. It's the first Pearl Harbor air raid. Yeah, that's a big deal, right? Not December 7th, 1941. We're going to learn all about that. This is before the infamy, the first air raid on Pearl Harbor. And I'm joined today with Mr. Brad Ball. Brad is a man of many hats. He is a dedicated advocate for preserving aviation history and honoring our nation's veterans. A passionate enthusiast of all things aviation with a particular focus on World War I and World War II. Brad serves as a board member, executive committee member, and marketing chair for the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, where he works tirelessly to uphold the legacy of those who served. In addition to that, Brad is the president of the 475th Fighter Group, United States Army Air Force World War II Historical Foundation. He actively contributes as a board member and a volunteer to that organization. He has an extensive executive leadership background in industry, and he's a very good friend of mine in the museum. Brad, welcome today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Spin. It's an honor to be here, and it's nice to be able to put this story together with you and Ashley and the team's help. Fascinating story, as I think our followers today will find. There's been an awful lot, in fact, more than just about any single subject of World War II, debating the attack on Pearl Harbor, what we knew, why we didn't see it coming, or did we? And at the same time, figure out what we should have done to be more prepared. This talk today, is going to cover that subject. And I think you'll be just as amazed as we are when we found articles. I have the privilege of having been involved for over 10 years here with the museum from my base in Southern California. But I can tell you, no matter how much depth of knowledge we gain on this very important subject, I feel we're just still scratching the surface. And if I may, one of the great things that you're going to learn today is about a gentleman by the name of Harry Yarnell, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet, admiral, and it was with his vision and his leading chief of staff, John Towers, who conducted the very first attack, the very first surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. But most listeners, if we're asked the question, what was the date of that infamous attack? Of course, most would answer December 7th, 1942. 41, pardon me, I'm ahead of myself. And yet Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet, is credited with by both Japanese and Western writers for the bold, daring, and brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor. Ironically, however, the man who deserves the most credit for the blueprints is our featured subject today, and that's Harry Irvin Yarnell. After all, it was his architecture and proof that aircraft could sink battleships, a premise that goes all the way back to Billy Mitchell. And that's kind of where our story is going to begin. But first, let me just say, this attack and this surprised raid, if you will, was one of 21 different exercises that the Navy conducted over a 23-year period. They were called Fleet Problems. And I think that's an adequate name because Fleet Problems suggest it was serious, and they had to figure out how to combine all of the forces on sea or supporting from the land or even the air then. And this particular fleet problem that we're focusing on is Fleet Problem 13. So we'll get to that in just a minute, but we're going to wind backwards like a good film and start at the beginning. There's probably nobody on this Zoom that hasn't heard of Billy Mitchell, and probably because he's related to the court martial of Billy Mitchell. He was a significant member of the earliest of our use of aviation in war, World War I. And when he came on the scene after serving in the infantry, he brought his personal vision to how this nature of war should be fought from the air and not exclusively from land forces, much less sea forces. His role turned out to be way ahead of its time, but connected to each of the key players we're going to talk about on this webinar. He was under none other than General John Pershing in charge of the United States air units for all of Europe during the First World War. And he saw firsthand what its potential was when he assembled the largest collection of aircraft for a major battle in France, over 1,400 aircraft in those early days, to support the ground troops. From that, he saw the potential of what aviation can do, and particularly after watching trench warfare and the futility of it, came to the conclusion that had been long held that as long as you have a body of ocean around your country, you're reasonably safe from invaders from too far away. Obviously, our East Coast have the Atlantic and the West Coast has the Pacific. Europe have their own oceans, but the fallacy, of course, is with aviation, the oceans don't matter. And he early on made the point that we should spend more time focusing on warfare through the air, because you can't build a wall and no one can own it exclusively the way fleets can take over bays or armies can take over villages. Billy Mitchell's doctrine was very controversial. And when he started telling his point of view, and he made a very specific point, since it seemed to him that they were falling on deaf ears, that he should let the press know. And the press ate up every word he published. Not only did they eat it up, but as he used his platform to share what he knew about the latest technology and opportunities to build a better defense for our country by having it appear in the papers. And if you think about it today, most recently today, a week doesn't go by that either our country, Ukraine, or Russia, or China, or Korea have articles about their latest missile strength and the capability of their armament. That's not a new concept, and Mitchell played it to the hilt. But he played it to the hilt to such a degree that he was court-martialed. 1925, he went before his panels and Air Force. The courtrooms were packed with press. And he made his case because he had been saying over and over again, in essence, the military leaders of this country are inept. They're asleep at the switch. And between the Army and the Navy, it's the blind leading the blind. And we are getting further behind other nations, and in particular, Japan. Now, some of you will know that in 1905, Japan shocked the world by sinking the massive Russian fleet with their own Japanese fleet of battleships and cruisers. But that was just the beginning for Japan, who started their conquest of the Southwest Pacific as they were planning their eventual war against our country.
Well, Brad, if we could move from understanding Mitchell and his vision of air power as critical to our nation's defense, how does our Navy play into that? What was their attitude?
Very good point. And let me just leave you with one additional point that good old Mitchell had. And I hope no one's going to be able to read this, but I'll quickly read the highlights. This is a letter that Billy Mitchell in 1924 sent to the War Department, and it was one of the documents for which he was brought to trial for insubordination. Our Air Force, as such, has almost ceased to exist, tactically much more than technically, but both are bad enough. We are again down to the position of the blind leading the blind. And the answer is an independent air service to get them as far away as possible from the Army and the Navy as they have always been known. With the development of our methods, we can absolutely dominate sea areas practically anywhere. And it is only this sure method of national defense that we have at the present time where we could dominate. Our people are not inclined to have an army of any size and really do not need one. All the Navy does is to follow behind that of England, whereas if we went anywhere near Japan, they would never come back. The Japanese Air Force would destroy them at once. That was written in 1924. Spin, you said, where does this bring the Navy?
Yeah.
Well, when the War Council met in 1922 to lay down new rules of armament and military size, they limited the top 5 countries, the United States, the UK, England, the United States, UK, France, Italy, and Japan on how many destroyers they could have, how many aircraft they could have. It was an early attempt to really contain what we would call, even to this day, just the militarization of each country and leading to trouble on and on and on. At that point, there was virtually no interest by our country and leadership for any additional heavy expenditure coming out of World War I. In fact, we pushed for a more neutral point of view, an America first, if you will, but a neutral point of view. And when appropriations were made, no cruisers were added to the fleet. 8 new battleships were, as the future of military warfare on the seas, but no cruisers. And cruisers, being the fastest warships that we have, were at the time the eyes of the fleet. These were this role got them ahead of the fleets moving up and down the coast and further out to sea in order to give some semblance of long-range reconnaissance. What's out there? For years, the closest thing to reconnaissance, and remember in the 20s, radar was probably not even a word, but the fact is in the 20s, long-distance surveillance was related to, could you see the smokestacks of an approaching Navy? A 50, 60, 70-mile range might give you a couple of hours of warning. Well, that was clearly not enough, and it was clearly not enough back in 1941. But what came to the forefront rather quickly, Mitchell was court-martialed. He was dismissed from the military for 5 years without pay. He stepped down and said, thank you, I'll pursue my own activity without interference. And the leadership of the Navy, one individual by the name of Moffett, came to the forefront, who was then leading the naval air forces. Now, the reparations that Germany was forced to accept included taking their classic Zeppelins, as they were called back then. These were the first bombing airships that were very effective over London in World War I. But these 600, 700, 800-foot flying vessels had little or no support until people saw what they could possibly do as the new eyes of the fleet. And Moffett became its biggest proponent. In fact, the reparations ended up that the U.S. received 2 of the Zeppelins that the Germans had created and renamed them the Los Angeles and the Shenandoah. This is Admiral Moffett. And those of you that are familiar with the West Coast know that Moffett Field, just south of San Francisco, with the massive hangars, were those that were built for these rigid airships, as they were called. I grew up in Orange County, and we too had the same architectural design. In fact, just in the last 15 months, one of them burnt to the ground. They're historic landmarks, but more importantly, there have never been anything quite like it. They're so large, they have their own atmosphere inside and rain. Moffett saw what could happen when the potential of the long-term eyes of the sea eyes of the fleet, could be put to use with these vessels. And he wasn't trying to say that this was going to get rid of the battleships. It wasn't going to overtake the value of aircraft. It was going to be a frontline participant, though, the new battle line with the carrier fleets. And the carriers, together with longer range surveillance, would have far more warning and capability to identify You can see they even could fly at night just a minute ago. But the point is, they were absolutely magnificent, but they were burdened with vulnerabilities. These were largely built to use hydrogen, and we know many years later what happened in Lakehurst, New Jersey with the Hindenburg. But during the early days with the Zeppelins in Germany and London, and into the first two aircraft vessels, if you will, it was hydrogen, until we realized that we were a nation blessed with helium, virtually the global supply of it. Engineers reconfigured these to have helium to eliminate the massive risk of fire. In these rigid airships, they were, as we said, they were capable of 3 or 4 key advantages. One, significant range. They could go out and back over a 12-hour period and cover 8 times the surface of the ocean for surveillance that any of our ships could do. They could carry 4 times the load, and it made it possible to turn these into flying aircraft carriers with smaller size fighter biplanes such as the Sparrowhawk, a unique aircraft. And you see the mechanism on the center of the top wing. That is a trapeze device where the pilots would fly up underneath the rigid airship, have that special device that hooks onto the top of the wing in the aircraft, cut the engine, and the airship would reel in this aircraft, put it on a conveyor belt inside, and store 6 of these in airborne hangars. So now we had aircraft carriers with huge hangar bays, but we also had these that could be lowered throughout the exercises, whether it was a fleet problem or in war, and fly way ahead of the surface fleets and get an extra 200 to 300 miles of warning and observation.
Well, with understanding the experimentation with rigid airships and the Navy Zeppelins, concurrent, Moffett and Reeves are still working to build aircraft carriers in the Navy. So bringing aircraft to the fleet on the decks of specialized ships becomes a thing. Those war problems, the fleet problems, practice using these carriers in war. So Navy experimenting with it. So where does Admiral Yarnell come into this story now?
Well, very good point. So Admiral Yarnell was again the father of the modern aircraft carrier. Reeves, of course, took the picture that just before you click back of the 3. It was a deck only that had been a converted ship really early in the process, in the early teens, and Reeves made it possible to create the operationalization, if you will, on how to land and take off multiple flights quickly. When Yarnell took over as the admiral and had a chief of staff like Tom's, you can see that the potential of building a more powerful and a more potent Navy was there, but it had to be proven. It had to really prove itself in combat. And we talk about fleet problems. They should not be confused with war games. Fleet problems were created by and engineered by the fleets from the real experience in the ocean and to replicate what it was like at war. The Navy College came up with war games. And while those are important, the real thing is of course the substitute that cannot be, is no substitution, I should say, for what took place. When you look at, this is Yarnell.
And Yarnell, yeah.
Yes. So these are the two, really the modern fathers of the aircraft carrier. And we should note that for their size, there was nothing faster on water. The Saratoga and the Lexington were capable of 33 knots. And our battleships, which led the charge with their destroyer and convoy protection, nevertheless could not keep up with these, which obviously came to play when we got closer to 1941, when Japan, that had a significant number of carriers, was able to, pull off their surprise attack and covering hundreds and hundreds of miles undetected. Yarnell felt that a huge fleet problem was something we knew when we made an agreement, if you will, a treaty with Hawaii at the turn of the century, 1900, to occupy and take Pearl Harbor as part of a coaling station where ships would refuel with coal. And little by little, the Army became part of that with the Navy, and everyone realized that would be a pretty good naval base. Because up to that point, 1925 or so, we were a one ocean Navy. That was on the Atlantic side. On the Pacific coast, San Francisco and San Diego were our anchorages, and their job was to patrol all the way down to Panama, all the way up to Alaska, all the way out to Hawaii. When that War Council met in 1922, we just let Japan have what they wanted. One, they got to maintain their fleets, but they had everything in the South Pacific and started acquiring and invading not just China, but before that, the South Pacific, and all the way up to, but not the Philippines. We had access to the Philippines and Guam, but the vast majority of the surface ocean was left to Japan from their shorelines to Hawaii. Therefore, our vulnerability led to wanting to understand if we could close that gap, have better long distance surveillance, and Fleet Problem 13 became the exercise to prove that. Now, as good as the specs, if you will, for these rigid airships were, two new ones were built, the Akron and the Macon, and they were going to be part of these fleet exercises, but one thing led to another, and they had enough mechanical issues. At one point, Moffett invited members of Congress to take a ride on the Akron. They were sitting in as they were taking off from the West Coast. The tail fell off while it was still tethered, and it took 2 months to repair, so it was unable to participate in this fleet exercise. Meanwhile, leading up to February 7th, 1932, nearly 10 years ahead of Pearl Harbor, Yarnell was planning this exercise with his carriers, and on that early morning, Sunday morning, how ironic, launched 150 aircraft to take on the defending fleet, which was in Pearl Harbor, tethered. And yet, while there were Army personnel, the fact of the matter is it was Sunday morning. Yarnell and the pilots maneuvered with excellence. They dropped flour sacks to emulate bombs, and there were umpires stationed throughout this exercise to determine, based on the location of the aircraft or the defenders or the defending or the opposition side, whether or not a ship would have been damaged. And unanimously, the umpires said that Yarnell's fleet sunk those ships in Pearl Harbor, took out all the air bases surrounding the harbor, and awarded the Fleet Problem winner as being the Yarnell fleet. Well, guess what? The Navy battleship admiral, I guess they're called the battleship admirals, pitched a fit and said, that's not right. First of all, they didn't play fair. I mean, let's look at the facts. They did it Sunday morning. That's an unconventional time to attack. We have most of the people on leave. It's a day of worship. People were not actively ready to defend. Secondly, we were looking to the east, where Japan is located, and you attacked from the west. Well, they made up all of these excuses as to why they were caught flat-footed, and ultimately they were forced to say that the Navy defenders at Pearl Harbor, in fact, prevailed on Fleet Problem 13. Problem number one, right, Spin?
Yeah, you have to recognize it, what actually happened, and then be able to react to it, right? And so just kind of denying what happened. I think it's also interesting that at least at this time, we see here with our battleships, but there's aircraft on the battleships. So it's not that the Navy didn't appreciate the airplane. It's at sea, it's being used, but it's like the 1932 early morning attack was just so overwhelming. I got to imagine that they wanted to litigate through tort that it just couldn't happen, right? Isn't that protecting your own sacred cow?
Well, and of course it is when you go back the number of years and over 100 and couple of 100 years, the Great White Fleet, the British ruling the seas, seven seas. It was hard to argue against, the physical presence of what these battleships had to offer, but what they lacked were the quantity necessary given the scope and how war how war in Japan in particular was preparing for something far bigger than those battleships could maintain. And yes, the Navy did have those float planes, and that they were largely for observation. There's no way that 3 or 4 of those things could defend 2 carrier loads of aircraft coming at them. In fact, in his defense, Billy Mitchell argued that the cost of one battleship back then at $1 million could purchase 1,000 aircraft. And he argued for that in 1925. So, the battle over appropriations and the limited funding, obviously that hasn't changed. We see that every day in our lives today. The decision, however, is which ones have the most tactical, proven success. And lo and behold, having this 1932 exercise should have been enough for more significant changes, but they weren't. It was obvious that there was still plenty of work to do, and frankly, to take more seriously what was happening in Japan and up and down the Southwest Pacific area.
So then we have our staff for Fleet Problem 13 here. So after 1932, did the Navy not try this again? Was the lesson just forgotten, or did it?
If at first you don't succeed, defend again. And in 1938, Ernest King, these were the F4Us, the best of the day that Yarnell had on his decks, and they were certainly good enough to inflict plenty of harm, but in quantity they were really difficult to defend. What you know about Navy aviation attacking ships is if you can spray enough bullets on the deck of a ship, you can distract the hell out of anybody shooting the artillery back at you because they're ducking for cover. And in this particular case, he proved that quantity does really matter. In 1938, another admiral by the name of King, who had been responsible for the North Atlantic and what the German U-boats were doing to the convoys, was brought back into the Pacific region, and it was his fleet problem that virtually pulled off the same plan that Yarnell did, and again, using the judges of the umpires, beat the anchored fleet and all that was around it to defend it. So you have 2 examples of it looking as indefensible as possible, only to have within 3.5 years everything that everyone on this Zoom knows happened, and that they were in fact once again not prepared.
So here's Admiral Towers in World War II, and how does he play into our story?
Well, he was the chief of staff. He was chief of staff for none other than Yarnell, and Towers was just as big as his name implies. He took this fleet problem, and back in 1935, they did a fleet exercise 16, which covered 5 million square miles north central Pacific from Midway to Hawaii to the Aleutian Islands, involving 321 vessels, 70,000 men. And as these fleet problems began to kind of materialize, this is an easy visual to put right here. Again, gumming through Billy Mitchell's time. Billy Mitchell was able to get permission to prove an airplane could sink a battleship. He proved it 8 or 9 times over, because there were 2 mothball battleships, one we captured from the Germans in World War I and one of our own, many submarines, many cruisers and destroyers, and with biplanes in front of admirals watching from the decks of their battleships. Mitchell sunk these ships in front of their very eyes. And as the story goes, many of the admiral and senior leadership were wiping tears away because they saw a change in how warfare would evolve. The good news is it evolved the right way, which was a combination of a fleet of fast-moving ships that could help launch aircraft as well as deploy troops to take over the islands. But you look at these pictures and you say, how in the world could all of that one be organized in a way to be effective? I mean, I think most of us wonder how they could even take off from such short distances. But again, that was part of the ingenuity of what this type of warfare did, only to see where we are today, which is, many times more potent and certainly on a much higher level of technology, including, what drones will do in the future and are doing right now.
Well, we're getting some questions from our viewers, and one of our viewers have asking, were there foreign military observers to the fleet problems? Were the Japanese aware of Fleet Problem 13 and what came of it? Seems how they,
Yes.
Seems like they did somehow.
Yes. First of all, the fleet problem on the Fleet Problem 13 that we just talked about had incredible press coverage. So it was all throughout the press. Secondly, Japanese diplomats from Japan were in Oahu and were hearing and sort of seeing accounts of the exercise. Back in 1950, John Towers, whose picture you saw and sort of led the actual attack on behalf of Yarnell, was dining in Tokyo with a Japanese vice admiral who had participated in the real Pearl Harbor attack, 1941. And he said, quote, "He told me he had simply taken a page out of our own book," unquote.
It's amazing. That's amazing. Also, we have to assume that naval attachés were aware and observed in Honolulu and Washington, D.C. The Fleet Problem 13 was reported in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and then a whole spread in Time Magazine. A whole spread in Time Magazine. It's amazing. The Free Press was reporting these things.
Yes.
We have another question here. So what was the plan and radius? So the scope of Fleet Problem 13 in the Pacific, how did the problem play out?
Well, the short answer is it wasn't quite as big as the one I just mentioned, but it was still huge. They attacked, they parked about 100 miles off Oahu. So, and they started just before dawn, exactly as we know happened in 41. They were able to attack from a different angle. And the strategy, again, we saw play out was to first take down the air bases. I think there were 7 air bases on the island of Oahu that at one point or another were defending all of the islands. There were air bases, of course, on Maui as well. But the point is, what Japan learned from that was to put your fastest plane in the skies first, which is why on their December 41 raid, they left with the Japanese Zeros. One, they could take off faster with shorter runway lengths on the carrier because the rest of it were occupied by the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers. And that same method was deployed by Yarnell with aircraft like this that were also torpedo bombers, as well as dive bombers and the fighters. So both in terms of the execution from a military equipment standpoint to the sequence within which the attack took place, like very smart chess moves. You do this first, and then you do this second. And in the case of Yarnell, and then later with King, again, there's just no other way to say it. What was really done here? Probably the biggest thing that happened after the Yarnell raid was fortification with artillery. But as far as really taking advantage of the eyes of the fleet, to get much more surveillance well in advance of attacking at our own docks and our own shores. That was really the unfortunate part that has been debated. In fact, both the head of the Army and the head of the Navy stationed on Oahu were basically laid blame, sent to court. Basically, they had to find someone to blame, only to have both of them exonerated. Help me spin. I don't know how many years later, but it was a number of years later.
Absolutely. Going back to the outline of Fleet Problem 13, many of the fleet problems were in conjunction with a joint Army-Navy exercise.
Correct.
And Fleet Problem 13 was. And this exercise assumed that the enemy force, the Black Force, had captured the Hawaiian Islands, and that the Blue Force, the U.S. force, mission was to recapture the Hawaiian Islands. Right. So you had an enemy battle fleet and defenses on Hawaii to prevent the American force from recapturing. And this war game, as well as each one of these war games for all the years that the Navy conducted them, included every ship of the Navy. There was over 200 or maybe 300 ships involved in these exercises. For Fleet Problem 13, the Army provided 20,000 troops in 17 or 18 transport ships that were going to move to do the recapture of Oahu. So it's pretty incredible. The other thing I think our visitors need to remember is that the way the Navy originally envisioned aircraft on the aircraft carriers was like the Zeppelin and the aircraft on the Zeppelins as scouts to look for where the enemy is, and then the battle line would deploy from some safe place and move into and to engage the enemy force. And so the aircraft was a supporting force. So Yarnell is thinking, no, this is strike warfare. It's offensive. Then we can use the aircraft to strike the enemy, and in this instance, at anchor in the harbor. I got to imagine that it was such an obviously brilliant thing that it really gored some sacred cows. You have to happen.
Let me just mention this important point. As everyone knows, we weren't the only nation with a navy. The Royal Navy was, as significant and even more so earlier than we were for all of their colonization and what they did over the centuries. But about a year after the first attack, the Royal Navy, with a very slow-moving dive bomber called the Swordfish, attacked the Italian fleet at its base in Taranto, Taranto. This torpedo attack was significant, and Japan paid attention. And the main thing they did wasn't to step up their manufacture of aircraft. They were committed, but they realized we need a torpedo bomber to maybe also inflict the damage and sink these fleets. Our side of it was that Pearl Harbor was in the 35-foot depth range, and there was no way that a torpedo could be launched from an airplane. The angle of attack would just have it auger into the bottom of the bay there, whereas that bay in Italy was 75 feet deep, and they had enough clearance for the torpedo to level off and do its damage. But as you may be aware, the Japanese created torpedoes with a special device on its fin so that it could quickly, once it hit the water, go to a parallel lower, very shallow depth that they had to deal with to take out the fleet surrounding Ford Island.
We received another question here. Why did the American public not respond to the growing pre-war danger to the fleet at Hawaii? And is there any lessons we can apply today? Well, I would just have to say, I don't know if the people even thought there was a threat.
Well, I do think, and I could be wrong about the timing on this, but people have to remember that Lindbergh was a very staunch neutral proponent that we should stay out of this war. He was reprimanded by taking an invitation to see the Air Force of the German Army leading up to World War II. But he made the case that we're not prepared and we should probably not fight that. After all, we saw what happened in Europe. Despite winning, it was a very costly experience. He made such, in many ways, he became his own Billy Mitchell, rubbing facts in front of the noses of the leadership. And frankly, Franklin Roosevelt did not want Lindbergh anywhere near what was going on. And we've talked about this in other webinars. He did become of value, but he wanted to enlist as a pilot and help train pilots to have more effect. So that's a long answer to the question. There was enough going on, but it's not like we are today, where social media can overrule big newspapers or publication organizations, because the groundswell on millions of phones and social media platforms is a hard thing to muzzle. Thank goodness.
Yeah, and as it was, the last fleet problem in 1940 was also the largest, right? It involved the whole of the Navy in Hawaiian waters, duplicating some of the lessons that were learned in previous fleet problems, seizing the advanced naval bases, anti-submarine warfare, strike warfare, using aircraft carriers independent of the battle line as a separate task force. But it was in that and that working was observed. A part of it was observed by President Roosevelt in California waters. But when it concluded, he ordered the fleet to stay in Hawaii. Right. So that's when the battle fleet was ordered to remain in Hawaiian waters as a deterrent to the Japanese. Again, the way the deployments were in the decade before World War II, if the Navy was deployed to the Pacific, the battle force, the battleships and the cruisers, were in San Pedro Bay. And that's where the Long Beach Naval Station was ultimately built. But they were at anchor in San Pedro Bay in Los Angeles. And then the aircraft carriers and the submarines and destroyers were all home ported down in San Diego. And the big shipyard was in Vallejo and in Vallejo, California, and Bremerton in Washington. So all the logistical support was on the Pacific coast, and then the move the fleet to Hawaii seemed like from that political perspective, like, it's a deterrent, but was very upset with that. Couldn't support it, felt that they were exposed.
Well, it cut the distance not in half, but it certainly cut down on the distance to defend against Japan, as we saw when Japan nearly won the Battle of Midway, which would have opened up yet another invasion in Hawaii and a direct line to the West Coast. Japan did the U.S. a favor by not executing its third wave when they attacked on the morning of December 7th. They needed to take out our oil supplies and our fuel supplies on Oahu, which by not doing that allowed us not just to rebuild 16 of the 19 ships that were sunk, but to not move those navies back to San Diego and Southern California all the way up to Washington, and have to supply chain fuel across the Pacific if we were going to keep that fleet there. So things started to work in our favor, but at a high expense. And finally, I'll say that the Midway, once again, proved what all of these fleet problems were building the case for, and that is the battle line was now going to be aircraft carriers, not battleships, because we were able to sink 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers in under 5 minutes. And of course, wars in the waters of the Pacific that are largely fought on water and on small islands needed those carriers for aircraft to go wherever the battle was. And Japan never fully recovered from losing those 4 carriers.
No. And so it's interesting that as we had a technical surprise, maybe even an operational surprise on December 7th, 1941, but the Navy was prepared strategically and doctrinally for what was going to come next, how it was going to fight. And it learned those lessons in these fleet problems, where a lot of the commanders of World War II, like Towers, were young men, either staff officers or even actual hands-on junior leaders. And so it's just interesting how they learned and were able to execute when it came. we could probably argue or discuss the lack of Army Navy coordination in these times. It was notional. The Army is going to have air defense and fighters to defend this, the Panama Canal or Hawaii. But then, how are we going to fight as a force, a combined force? I think at the War College level, it was taught in thought, but practically maybe not.
Well, you have to say there's some irony in all of this because Mitchell, who was singularly damned by the leadership in the military, a few years later was recognized for his long vision, and they named a significant aircraft, the Mitchell B-25 bomber. How ironic that that was the plane that made its case to inflict a huge morale issue for the Japanese in 42 with the 30 seconds over Tokyo raid off of carriers, no less, to Japan. And, I think as you look at everything, football is this way. Isn't it easy to watch what you should have done Monday morning with the game films?
Yeah.
In this particular case, I have to tell you, in 2003, I was able to take a producer and go to Kitty Hawk for the 100th anniversary of flight. I was ecstatic to be at that sacred grounds with the world congregating to learn about that really big day in the history of aviation. And I was a guest of the Air Force. And the Air Force came out and had the top 100 living or past aviators and recognized people that all of you on this Zoom could identify or have your names you'd put forth. And I asked a leading military Air Force executive leader, can I ask you a wild question? What do you think of Billy Mitchell? And I was expecting to hear something. You know what? He was kind of badly treated and given look. He got what he deserved. He was insubordination. Insubordination is almost as bad as the enemy itself.
Yeah.
And so I learned my own lesson about the importance of military is order and discipline and recognizing authority. Unfortunately, in this particular case, it took a lot. It took Mitchell and others behind him, the Moffats, the Yarnells, the Towers, the Kings, all of those, and their dedicated men and women to say that we've got to be open to change. And
It's good to know. I think it's important to know that the general officers on Mitchell's court martial board, one of them was none other than Douglas MacArthur, who was a personal friend of Mitchell, and he thought about recusing himself because of that, but they asked him to stay on. He was the only member of the board to not vote. He felt if he voted to quit, that would not have been honorable because he was a personal friend, so he abstained. We have a question here from what were the names of the aircraft carriers used in Fleet Problem 13? We have a photograph right here of those three carriers off Honolulu. The aircraft carrier closest in is CV4, the USS Ranger, our first keel up built aircraft carrier. And the other two beauties in the back are the Lexington and the Saratoga, CV2 and CV3. The Saratoga and the Lexington are identical twins. They were begun in life as battle cruisers, completed as full-blown, well-designed aircraft carriers pursuant to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. You can always, before World War II, you can always tell the Saratoga from the Lexington because of the big black stripe down Saratoga's funnel. So naval aviators wouldn't mistake which carrier to land on. But those are the three carriers. Yarnell had the Saratoga and the Lexington in his force, and the Ranger was a part of the Black.
And what's remarkable is, and give a shout out to the engineering manufacturers and the military visionaries themselves to take cruisers, which had the highest speed, and mount the carrier decks and all it takes to fly aircraft off of there and get that 33 knot speed. It's
absolutely
almost impossible.
I think for today to understand also, we start the war with essentially, uh, 6 to 8 aircraft carriers, right? So the Lexington is not, is old and is a seaplane tender. The CD-1 is not in the picture, but Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. So 7 carriers, and all of them by the end of 1942, early 43, all of them are sunk except for the Enterprise and the Saratoga. And Saratoga was damaged badly by torpedo twice in the early part of the war. So it's really, we hear that phrase, come as you are, right? We had the luxury of building those light carriers, like the Independence class carriers that you were just talking about, Brad. We had the luxury of building the Essex class carriers, many of which were under construction on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. That Navy that we had before it started, that's what we fought
Well,
for the first 2 years.
it's safe to say without the carriers, it would have been a very different war, sadly, because it took the Naval Air and Marine Air Corps together with all of those troops that were killed, taking over the beaches, and then the battleships roll, pounding with destroyers, pounding the bases and the beaches before the troops would walk into a hellfire, so to speak. One thing I'd like to say was we've talked about the rigid airships, which we believe is a discussion for another webinar at another time. But the Sparrowhawk, and I'll just show you the cover of one of the publications, this Sparrowhawk, and you can see the trapeze hook on the top of the wing. One of the most important companies today in our defense is General Atomics. They're based in San Diego, and they're really the parent company of the first drones for military use back with the CIA in the 50s. They have an aircraft, their drones today are the state of the art. And it's interesting, as we were doing the homework, that they have a drone that launches smaller drones that then return to the bigger drones. They're called parasites. That's how they referred to these back then. And there's actually a video about their use if you're in the market to buy one of these, although you need some credentials and a good checkbook to see how these parasite drones do their work and then are tethered back in just exactly as was envisioned and executed in the 1930s. So sometimes it takes longer to perfect an idea and get it right.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And some ideas for just have their time. We could talk about Northrop's flying wing concept, as well as drones. We come back to them, but the aircraft carrier still is important and still has great relevance in our modern world. And we are certainly are on the shoulders of good and great men and women that were before us to see that, have the vision to figure all this out. Without a doubt, we're beginning to get to our last minutes of our program. We'll see if there's any more questions that we can.
As you're looking for that last question, let me just say, and I wouldn't, I will hear from the rest of my board members if I don't say to our audience today, as much as we hope you've learned some things because we did preparing for this, there is no substitute than to see it in person. So consider your fleet problem. If you haven't been to Pearl Harbor, that's your fleet problem. You can have the War College and sort of study this from books from home, wherever you live. But if you don't take your family to Pearl Harbor and see what really took place and how it's being preserved, which is the role we have on behalf of the aviation role there, you're really missing a significant part and its impact around the world. So we encourage you, this website will tell you everything you need to know about a trip you'll never, ever forget.
Absolutely. We have another question from one of our listeners and viewers. How effective were seaplanes during the Pacific War? Wow. Does PBY Catalina come to mind? And again, some ideas are so awesome. They're coming back into the model.
You know, the PBY is it's an excellent question, because when the rigid airships, for their long range, their incredible lift, their incredible speed compared to conventional aircraft up to that point, nevertheless, those vulnerabilities were enough to not have any more than 5 of them built. And PBY, on all of its iterations, became the new eyes of the fleet. And we had the largest base right where our museum is today, Hangar Base, Hangar 6, and several of the various bases on Hawaii. And they became the long range 2,500 mile range. And it was the PBYs that found the Japanese fleet 200 miles before they got to Midway, giving us time to respond. And then finally, it was the PBYs themselves were so important to surveillance that Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, where it stands today in the exact same 100-year-old buildings, was ground zero for the first bombs that Japan dropped on December 7th. They wanted those PBYs to be taken out so they couldn't find their fleet 200 miles off one of the Hawaiian islands and take them out. So good question. And thank you. We appreciate
One
your
more
asking.
question here, was the push to add more carriers to Pacific Fleet the result of the fleet problem results? I'd have to say yes. I mean, that's, the number of carriers that we did just as a random number. The Navy determined in these war games and in studies at the Naval War College what was going to be needed, and that is what was built.
I think it proved too, with a war that was fought largely over water, that you needed as much aviation in those days to finally execute success. And the big battle internally that held this up was the Army's view with the Air Force and, up to then B-17 bombers. B-17s were used to drop bombs on the Japanese fleet at Midway. And there's film of this showing the Japanese carriers with evasive action, almost like they're skywriting in the ocean with their huge wakes. Not a single bomb from the many dropped from the B-17s hit any of the carriers. They just didn't have the quote precision bombing that had always been advertised, much less the precision. So building more of these floating runways was really a significant reason for the success of our battle with Japan.
And another question here: when did the Army Air Corps switch from biplanes to monoplanes? And that actually is in the middle 1930s, and it's the bomber development where we get the big Martin bombers is the monoplane, and the early B-17s, and the early Curtiss Hawk variances that are all of course the P shooters, P-26.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look up the P shooter, the P-26. Yeah. It looks an awful lot like the Sparrow with this aerodynamic ring that allows it to be a little more aerodynamic, but it's a single engine, all aluminum mono. It's a gorgeous airplane by almost Art Deco or 30s design, and one thing led to another. So mono wings were absolutely better.
But the Navy was slow. The Navy was slow to lose its monoplanes, because we're seeing some of our photos here of our carriers. These were 1930s photos, 36, 37, some of them, and we have Boeings and Curtiss aircraft with that are biplanes still.
Yeah.
All right. So being signaled that we need to wrap it up as we could here. I think we had a pretty good discussion, Brad. I think we've set the ground for another webinar in the new year for Navy Zeppelins, for non-rigid or for rigid airships, and to see what that was all about, what Moffett was trying to push the Navy toward. That might be a future one. Very exciting. So folks, thank you so much for being with us today, learning a little bit about these fleet problems between the world wars as the Navy, as a professional institution, dealt with new technologies, new tactics, and new doctrine, and young leaders earned their spurs, earned their stripes, and became those leaders that we know about from World War II. Please come and visit us here at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. As Brad said, there's so much more to share and offer with you. We're very excited about it. Brad, thank you so much for being with me today, just kind of geeking out over this.
Yeah,
appreciate it very much.
Spin, thank you, and Ashley, who's doing all the work off camera. And I'd just like to say thanks to everyone that joined today. And for those of you that know you can find things on YouTube beyond the next Tyson fight, don't forget to see this will be posted on as all of our webinars are. And please tell your friends about it, because we're anxious for these stories to be heard as wide and deep as possible. So thank you.
Absolutely. We'll have a new webinar schedule for 2025 up soon. Until then, thank you again so much for being with us. Aloha, a hui ho.